The evening sun was sinking low, spilling gold across the long road that cut through the valley like a wound the land had learned to live with. Dust rose in soft clouds, turning the world hazy, almost dreamlike, as if time itself was slowing to witness the struggle of one woman alone. Mara Ellsworth leaned forward with all her weight, rope digging cruelly into her shoulders as she dragged the half-broken wagon inch by inch. Her breath came out in thin, tremoring strands. Even from far away, one could see the exhaustion shaking through her, the way her knees trembled, the way her hand drifted from time to her belly, as though whispering a prayer to the child she carried. And though the town watched, not a soul stepped forward. People filled the porches the way crows fill fence posts, silent, observant, waiting for the world to turn cruel so they could tell the tale later. Silas Crowley, the storekeeper, was the first to speak loud enough for others to hear, though he claimed not to be speaking to anyone at all. Pregnant widow dragging trouble into town, he muttered, wiping his hands on his apron, though they were already clean. Should have stayed where she came from. Two women on the porch stiffened their shawls and traded knowing looks. Mara heard the whisper of gossip tighten like wind around her ears. Still she pulled. One step, then another. A small sound, almost a whimper, slipped from her lips, but she buried it behind clenched teeth. Sheriff Buck Renner strolled out from his office, his boots echoing heavily. He adjusted his hat and looked Mara over with a face that had never learned softness. "Abandoned cabin out by the West Ridge is open," he said, as if announcing something generous. "It's where you want to go if you can make it." Mara nodded once, because nodding was all she had left. She did not expect kindness, not anymore. She'd learned that the world had sharp edges meant to cut, and the only way to survive was to keep walking before the pain caught up. What she didn't know was that someone else was watching her too, quietly from the edge of the street. Calder Hayes stood beside his horse, leaning against the hitching post like he'd grown from the wood itself. Dust coated his boots, the fringes of his coat, the shadowed brim of his hat. He was a man who saved his words the way other men save bullets. Some said he kept to himself because he had no need for company. Others said he'd lost too much to risk caring again. He watched Mara, not with pity, not even with concern, but with a stillness that suggested he saw something the rest of town refused to. When the wagon was caught in a deep rut, Mara lurched forward, the rope snapping against her chest. For a moment, everything tilted, her vision dimmed, the world wavering like a mirage in summer heat. She steadied herself with a hand on the wagon, whispering to her unborn child, "Just a little more, just a little longer." Images flashed through her mind, fragments she tried to push away but couldn't. Her husband coughing through the long fever, the grave she dug beneath the cottonwood tree with her own shaking hands, the promise she made to the life inside her. "Just a little more," she murmured again, but this time her voice broke. Her knees buckled. She sank forward, palms scraping the dirt. For a breath, she stayed like that, shoulders bowed, hair falling loose around her face, as the world spun in a blur of colorless light. That was when Calder moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just steady steps, each one deliberate, as if he'd made a decision long before his boots began across the road. Mara didn't hear him approach. She was too lost in the trembling of her own body. But she felt his shadow fall across her like a calm moment of night settling over a storm. When she looked up, her eyes wide and wary, Calder was already crouching beside the wagon. He said nothing. His silence was its own language. His gaze flicked from the frayed rope to her scraped palms, then to the broken wheel. She braced herself. People usually came close only to judge or offer advice that felt like stones disguised as bread. But Calder simply rose to his feet, walked behind the wagon, slid his hands beneath the frame, and lifted the whole back and rose off the ground with a grunt of effort. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough with disuse. "You're coming with me." Mara blinked. She couldn't speak for a moment, breath stuck between disbelief and fear. I can manage," she whispered, even though she was clearly moments from collapse. Calder didn't answer. He only nodded toward the open land beyond town, toward the horizon washed in coppery light. Then he began walking, pulling the wagon behind him with ease she herself had not felt in months. There was no force in his words, no demand, only a quiet promise tucked inside them, the kind that settles into the bones before the mind understands. Mara hesitated, watching his back as he walked ahead. Something inside her shifted, too small yet too powerful to ignore. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and followed, her steps unsteady but certain. The road leading out of town stretched long and lonely, but somehow the loneliness felt different now, lighter, shared. They walked in silence. The only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath boots, the whisper of wind brushing through sage, and the soft clatter of the wagon calder steadied with each step. For the first time in weeks, Mara felt the world expand around her rather than close in. Even the colors looked different, sky bluer, the fading sun warmer, the shadows less sharp. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on her. Or maybe hope, thin as the crescent moon rising overhead, had begun to seep through the cracks of her life. Calder said little, but every so often he glanced back to ensure she was still on her feet. Each time, she straightened a little more, as though those small glances carried a strength she didn't know how to accept openly. When his cabin finally appeared, tucked near a thin ribbon of creek, smoke curling lazily from its chimney, it looked nothing like the abandoned shack the sheriff had appointed her. This place felt lived in, cared for, even if rough around the edges. Calder pushed the door open, stepping aside, so she could enter first. Mara didn't move. She stood in the threshold, trembling from exhaustion and something deeper, fear of hope, fear of staying, fear of being seen. Calder didn't reach for her, didn't urge, didn't stare. He simply held the door open against the falling light. She stepped inside, and in that quiet crossing, with the evening wind at her back and the creaking wooden floor beneath her feet, something small but miraculous happened, something the weary soul rarely recognizes in the moment it arrives. A future, faint and fragile, found room to breathe. The first night in Calder Hayes' cabin felt strange to Mara, too quiet, too warm, too safe in a way that scared her more than danger ever had. She lay on the small cot he'd given her, listening to the slow rhythm of the creek outside and the faint scrape of Calder's boots as he moved about the room with a gentleness that didn't match the breadth of his shoulders. Every so often she felt the cabin shift with his steps, and a strange peace slipped over her like a thin blanket. In the morning, she awoke to the smell of coffee and cornbread. Calder didn't announce anything. He never did. He simply placed a tin plate near her cot and stepped aside, busying himself with the stove. Mara felt a flutter in her chest at the quiet care he gave without naming it. Days passed in that soft, unspoken rhythm. Mara tried to sweep, to lift, to do the chores that made her feel useful, but Calder would gently still her hands. "You shouldn't carry," he'd say quietly, not meeting her eyes. She didn't argue, because somewhere beneath her ribs, she felt something loosen, tension she hadn't known she carried slowly unraveling. In return, she did the things he didn't notice he needed, stitched a torn seam in his coat, warmed water before he came in from the cold, placed a fresh towel by the basin. Their gestures bent toward each other without asking permission, the way vines twist together in search of sunlight. Old May Hargreaves visited one afternoon, shuffling in with a basket of dried herbs. Her eyes narrowed knowingly as they flicked from Calder to Mara. "That man's heart is stitched together strange," she whispered to Mara when Calder stepped outside. "But strong, stronger than he knows." Mara lowered her head, heat rising in her cheeks in a way she hadn't felt in years. But kindness has a way of drawing out cruelty's shadow. By the week's end, gossip trickled from town like storm water seeping under a door. Silas Crowley claimed Calder was being taken advantage of. Sheriff Renner hinted that a woman like Mara looked for soft places to land. Even passing ranch hands muttered things Mara wasn't supposed to hear. She pretended not to listen, but each word left a bruise. Calder, hearing bits of it in town, said nothing, his silence different now, taut like barbed wire. One evening, Mara stepped outside to breathe. The world felt heavy in her chest, as though her ribs were too small for all the doubt inside them. Two women walking the ridge path whispered sharply as they passed. A burden dressed as a blessing. Poor Calder. Doesn't even see it. Mara stood frozen long after they disappeared. Shame is its own kind of wind, cold, relentless, impossible to outrun. She pressed a hand to her belly and whispered, "Maybe we shouldn't stay. Maybe we're making trouble he never asked for." Inside, Calder noticed the slump in her shoulders, but she offered no explanation. He watched her from across the firelight, his jaw set, his hands still. For the first time, she saw something like fear in his eyes. It wasn't until 3 nights later that the quiet between them finally cracked. They sat at the small table, steam rising from their cups, the lantern flickering low. Mara's voice sounded thin when she finally spoke. "I shouldn't cause you trouble." Calder set down his cup, the scrape of metal onward echoing too loudly. "You aren't. That's not what the town says." He lifted his gaze, and the hurt there startled her. Town's been wrong plenty. Silence wrapped around them again. Calder looked at the fire, as if searching for a memory buried in the flames. "My sister," he said quietly, "was about your age." Mara's breath caught. Calder rarely spoke of himself. She was carrying too. Thought she could make it through the storm that came down sudden one winter. "I told her to wait, that I'd come get her come daylight." His voice wavered just barely. "I didn't make it in time." Mara felt her heart shift painfully. Calder wasn't trying to save her because he thought she was helpless. He was trying to rewrite a hurt carved too deep into his bones. She whispered, "I'm so sorry." He shook his head. "Not looking for sorry. Just don't want history repeating itself." Their eyes held for a long moment. Something unspoken moved between them. Something warm, trembling, unsteady as a colt learning to stand. But sometimes fate tests the fragile things first. And that night, the sky began to bruise a violent purple. Wind howled through the valley, rattling the loose boards on the barn. The creek outside roared louder than she'd ever heard. By midnight, the storm had become a living thing. Rain lashed against the windows. Lightning cracked open the sky. The earth shook beneath the weight of the thunder. Mara jolted awake, heart hammering. She heard the grinding sound of something shifting outside. Something heavy. The wagon. Her husband's wagon, holding the last thing she owned, the clothes he wore, the letters he wrote, was sliding toward the rising creek. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and rushed out. The wind nearly tore it from her hands. The ground squelched beneath her feet as she stumbled toward the wagon. It was teetering at the edge of the bank, half swallowed by mud. A surge of water slammed into its side. "No," she cried, reaching for it even as her legs shook under her. The baby kicked sharply, a frightened jolt. She clutched her belly, but refused to step back. Lightning flashed, illuminating her silhouette against the roaring storm, as she swayed dangerously near the edge. Then strong arms wrapped around her waist and pulled her back with sheer, desperate force. Calder's voice broke into the thunder. "Mara," she choked on rain and fear. "I can't lose it," she gasped. "It's all I have left of him." Calder turned her toward him, gripping her shoulders with both hands, his hat dripping streams of water down his face. "Nothing that matters is leaving tonight," he said fiercely. "Not you. Not that child." Before she could protest, he pushed her gently behind him and waded toward the wagon. Water rose to his knees, then his thighs. He dug his boots into the mud, grabbed the wagon's side, and heaved with a strength that made her breath catch. The current shoved against him like a living beast, but he didn't let go. With a guttural sound, he dragged the wagon inch by inch back to solid ground. When he reached her, soaked and shaking, Mara collapsed into the mud, then into tears. Not from fear, but because something inside her finally broke open. "Why?" she cried, voice trembling. "Why would you do all this for me?" Calder knelt in front of her, his breath ragged, rain running down his cheeks like tears he'd never allow. "Because someone should have done it for my kin," he said softly. "Because you deserve more than the world ever gave you." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something deeper, a vow forged from grief and grace. Mara reached for his hand with trembling fingers. Then, in a gesture as quiet as dawn, she guided his palm to rest against her belly. The baby stirred beneath his touch. Calder inhaled sharply, like the world had tilted beneath him. And in that moment, the storm seemed to soften. By morning, sunlight spilled into the cabin as if nothing had ever been broken. Calder was already awake, sitting by the window, carving something small from a piece of driftwood. Mara blinked sleep from her eyes and saw it. A tiny horse, delicate and imperfect, shaped with the tenderness of a man who still didn't know how to speak his heart. Her breath hitched. Something new, fragile and bright, settled inside her. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Not all miracles arrive with trumpets. Some come as quiet men carving toys for the children they've already begun to claim as their own. And if you, watching from wherever life has placed you, have ever felt unwelcome, unseen, or small on the long road you walk, remember this. Sometimes grace doesn't shout. Sometimes it simply stands beside you in the storm, lifts what you cannot lift, and leads you toward the one place. Your tired soul was always meant to rest,